Officials at the Central Park Zoo continue their efforts to rescue an owl that escaped its habitat last night.
Flaco.
Flaco or Flaco.
Bird's exhibit had been vandalized.
The Eurasian eagle owl flew off after a vandal cut the security mesh inside its exhibit.
Flaco Shawshanked out of that cage, in which he'd been living in for 12 years.
Officials with the zoo say they are more worried that the bird won't be able to survive on its own. It spent more than a decade in captivity.
He needs to be captured. Having been a captive bird for a long time, for years, it's surely lost its hunting skills.
People did not expect him to survive.
Flaco would prove them wrong.
This is the kind of story we need right now.
New York City's most popular owl is still flying free 1 year later.
Flaco spent most of his day on a branch at the top of a tree, so there's no capturing Flaco. Right now, he seems to be enjoying his place at the top of the Central Park food chain.
Three weeks later.
Flaco the owl died last night after flying into a building on the Upper West Side.
This is the kind of story we need right now.
Okay, I think it's important to stress that I'm not one of those pathetic opportunists who decides to have an opinion after something bad happens. I've been planning on discussing this screwed up situation for months, but in all seriousness, it aggravated me to such an intense level that I kept dragging my feet. Really, I tried avoiding this story, but as fate would have it, I would revisit this topic after news outlets began celebrating the 1 year anniversary of Flaco, the owl's escape from a zoo after some reprehensible criminal sabotaged its enclosure during the night. Now, a sane person would think this is terrible, right? An innocent animal forced into a dangerous environment where it doesn't know any better, where injury or death is the likely outcome, as has been the case with other animals that have been set free. But no.
Freedom. He meant resilience.
This is really an incredible opportunity for New Yorkers to see this truly magnificent Eurasian owl.
No, but I assume one of the first times it's flown in a long time, it looked like it enjoyed it.
He seems to be living a life of purpose now.
He was a real New Yorker.
Between intermittent breaks and ambient city noise, we listened for hooting. Who?
Even after death, people have expressed that they are happy that Flaco was able to live free for 1 measly year. His species can live to be over 60, you heard that right, over 60 years old in captivity. Flaco's situation demonstrated very well that there are two kinds of culpability. Of course, the main person who's at fault is the despicable person who vandalized the zoo's enclosure, putting their animal at imminent risk as well as destroying their expensive property. But the second kind? Well, it's the entity that fails to act to right a wrong when it's their responsibility. And what's worse, another party that encourages this bad behavior. Yes, I'm talking about the Central Park Zoo, one of the most famous zoos in the world, and the public.
It was 1 year ago today that the legend of Flaco was born.
Just a bird flying free can bring people together in a meaningful way.
I love this story. I love this story. It's so wonderful.
Flaco the owl. Photographers often gather in Central Park to try and capture this rare, magnificent bird enjoying some, oh my gosh.
Damn!
The absolutely dreadfully ignorant public who continue to put a positive spin on this crime and actually made calls for keeping Flaco out in the wilds of New York City to fend for himself. So basically, here's the nonsense that happened. Flaco escaped, and at first the zoo did the right thing and tried to capture the bird, laying out traps baited with dead and live rats. And so the story goes, Flaco wasn't going for it. He refused to be taken back to his zoo enclosure. Or, here's what they didn't put in the news. Crowds would form every time Flaco approached the traps, putting stress on the animal and ultimately making the area highly unpleasant to the skittish owl. You can see in this photo the crowds that formed. This is the likely reason the zoo couldn't catch Flaco. Among these crowds was this piece of work, David Barrett, remember this name, and other so-called bird watchers who abandoned the native birds to stalk Flaco around Central Park.
We just took a stroll in Central Park, and out of nowhere, there's hundreds of people out here just looking out for the owl.
We drive what's called the hoot route to look for him. Get in the car and drive past locations where we've recently or others have recently heard him hooting. That's really the way we find him now.
So naturally, Flaco, who originally hung around the zoo, moved further away. At first, the zoo was worried that the owl would starve. However, as the media puts it, he defied expectations, and after the 12 years of captivity that he was born into, he learned to hunt the rats that are in no short supply throughout the city. It was at this moment that the stupidity was fully initiated, and the glossy narrative began to be painted. Once Flaco started hunting, the zoo said that recovery efforts would be less intense, and that they would look to opportunistically recover him when the situation is right. So when would that be? With this, people started demanding that the owl just be left alone. You had David Barrett and a slew of other Flaco fanatics insisting that the zoo should no longer attempt to retrieve their animal, despite that Flaco, who is a Eurasian eagle owl, is not even native to the United States. On top of this, Flaco may have been so successful at finding rats because they might have been intoxicated with rat poison. Multiple experts emphasize this risk, as well as countless others. A Eurasian eagle owl had once escaped the Minnesota Zoo, only to be killed by a collision with a car a few days later. Another owl, a native barred owl that died after colliding with a truck in Central Park, was found to have lethal amounts of rat poison in its system. But did this deter the Flaco fanatics? What do you think? By now, he has become a shining example of resilience. Here he is after catching a rat last night, proud, looking at everyone who doubted him. Efforts to capture him continue, yet questions are getting louder regarding his return to captivity. It does not seem appropriate to return him to his tiny cage in the zoo after he has proven himself to be a healthy and very capable owl, said this Anke Froelich, a popular photographer whose captures fueled the hysteria even further. I saw Flaco in the zoo a few years ago and he looked very sad, staring at the glass window in a tiny concrete cage. So let's see, can you spot the difference? After recording this video, Flaco's toxicology report came back, revealing that this bird was suffering from exposure to not only 4 different rodenticides, as predicted, but so-called pigeon herpes. This disease would result in, quote, severe tissue damage and inflammation in many organs, including the spleen, liver, gastrointestinal tract, bone marrow, and brain, and the anticoagulants cause excessive bleeding. Thus, it is presumed his fatal collision with the window that he initially survived was caused from delirium from his compromised condition. This bird suffered horribly, and all in the name of people's feel-good narrative and anti-zoo beliefs.
I would bet that if Flaco could choose, he would choose his year of freedom, even though he died. He died free as opposed to being trapped in a cage.
What a disgrace. Christian Cooper, the man who threatened a lady over an off-leash dog and was rewarded with his own show over the incident, said he's probably super happy to be out of that cage. So apparently, a dog running around on the ground for a few minutes is terrible for birds, but an enormous escaped non-native owl didn't seem to faze him much. There was even a petition started by Nicole Barrentes, who was a wildlife campaign manager for the animal rights group World Animal Protection. Of course, to keep Flaco free, which thankfully didn't get that many signatures. But part of it reads, if Flaco is captured, he will return to a tiny, sad-looking excuse for an owl habitat. He deserves better. Please urge the Central Park Zoo to Flaco stay free and, if captured, to relocate him to a sanctuary. For reference, here is Flaco's tiny cage, which some cowardly British tourists who wanted to remain anonymous because they didn't want to upset the zookeepers have described as around the size of a telephone booth. Now, telephone booths come in different sizes, and here are a couple of examples from the UK. I can't really gauge the length and width, but the height, which Flaco obviously used, is not telephone booth-like, so that was a really unfair statement, and there's even one that compares it to a closet. Just because there are larger enclosures in existence doesn't make this one inadequate by any means. If it was really that small, Flaco wouldn't have developed the wing strength to ultimately survive in the wild. And what does that comment mean for pretty much every parrot owner? Even the largest XL commercial enclosures aren't like this, and parrots are far more intelligent than owls. Anyway, the Flaco situation demonstrated just how far people will take their uneducated anthropomorphism. People tend to see owls as these wise, fabulistic characters, or some noble, confident person with this facial expression. We enter our first day of elementary school greeted with sights like this. They are popular in cartoons and movies, and so many of us have grown up seeing these depictions. Yet some of us forget that they are birds. And relative to other birds, they are the most simple-minded. We even have goofy children's books written about this situation, because nothing screams child-friendly like glorifying criminal acts. Just look at some of the loony characterizations placed on this owl. Even Sesame Street got in on a lunacy. I admire Flaco because he had a big dream. He believed in himself and he followed his heart. Flaco, if you ever read this, I hope you'll fly over to Sesame Street for a visit. My nest is your nest. Ugh. But no one was a bigger insidious force for Flaco's freedom than, you guessed it, David Barrett. But just who is this splendid human? Barrett runs the X account Manhattan Birdwatch, an account that essentially turns certain avian creatures into celebrities. And the birds enjoy this status just as much as many human celebrities love being bombarded by the paparazzi. I've seen some of the saner bird watchers describe him as detrimental to wildlife and the serenity of the park. Essentially, Barrett has a certain incentive to fan the flames of the Flaco fanatism, and it's not what's best for the birds. Meanwhile, Flaco has been observed being mobbed by the birds that actually belong in the area, and at one point he left his usual range, with some speculating he was searching for a mate. All while this was happening, what did Central Park Zoo, a zoo so famous it was featured in a popular DreamWorks franchise,
well, this sucks,
although highly inaccurately, do about it? As noted previously, we are prepared to resume recovery efforts if he shows any sign of difficulty or distress. What? So basically, this ACA accredited zoo that's supposed to be a tier above the rest simply gave up after a measly 10 days. And then they just threw a tarp over Flaco's enclosure as if to hang their head in shame that he ever lived there. The enclosure is now apparently permanently defunct. Now, I acknowledge that the zoo at first gave a valiant effort, utilizing traps that in one case almost worked, and one anonymous zookeeper, who was not allowed to talk to the press, had expressed that they worked tirelessly to retrieve Flaco, saying, "We are stressed and frustrated and tired, and people have been up all day and night." Requests for comments were denied by the Wildlife Conservation Society, making me suspicious. Are they hiding antagonistic encounters with angry anti-zoo activists? Why stop at 10 days? Why? There's only one logical explanation. The Central Park Zoo was placed under tremendous pressure by animal rights nuts and their sympathizers to stay away from their own animal. They were likely petrified of the backlash they'd receive pursuing the bird, and people like Barrett's were hampering their efforts. But instead of telling them to back off, what did they do? They gave in. On an international stage, we have a government-funded zoo announce that it's okay to leave an exotic owl to roam the city despite the danger it faces. Oh well, he's hunting on his own, so he's good to go. They've proven that they are ready and willing to place their own animals at risk to appease the same people who want to erase zoos from existence. And it's possible, and I'd say even likely, that the fool who released Flaco is among them. The zoo certainly had options. They could have hired a falconer, which are people who regularly catch wild birds of prey, and train them to work with humans to track down Flaco. According to another owl expert, other methods haven't been tried. They described the capture of another owl, where they simply sprayed the bird with soapy water until it couldn't fly well. but I'm sure the zoo would be too gutless to try that. Instead, they threw their hands in the air, more concerned with their PR. In one case, a citizen who saw Flaco land on their window actually tried to call animal control, worried that the owl sounded like it was in distress, but no one cared. He was essentially treated like a wild bird that belonged outside. Miss Knighton was enthralled. She had not heard about Flaco. Worried that he might be in distress, she called around unsuccessfully to see whether someone might come to take him. The zoo not only abandoned Flaco, but they just let all these crazy people control the narrative of the situation. So many nuts were interviewed, just saying different variations of the same nonsense. Like Diane Starr, a person so inept that they won't even research basic facts about Flaco's non-migrating species before insisting they know what's best for the animal. For an owl designed to soar thousands of miles across oceans, isn't a flightless life in a cage the equivalent of physical and psychological torture, regardless of how long that life is? The ocean. Flaco's safety and welfare are important. But here's one more reason he shouldn't have been left out in the wild to fend for himself. Large owls are potentially dangerous. Some may find this thought amusing, but true crime fans may be aware of the famous murder case of Kathleen Peterson, in which her husband was convicted of killing her with a blunt force object. There's actually a pretty plausible theory that an owl was involved in Peterson's death, as the unusual marks found on her skull were in the shape of a bird's talons.
It should be mentioned that barred owls are known to owl experts to attack people out of the blue, unprovoked, with no warning.
And it's the talons that we say caused the lacerations, which caused her to bleed to death.
Olson says he was in this neighborhood near Brookside and Meyer Boulevard around 5:30 when an owl swooped from the trees above and attacked. It left him with 3 bloody puncture wounds on his scalp.
Noticed owls in the area, but last night, while on his walk, he got a little too close to their nest and bam, one of the owls hit him in the head.
Reports of owls attacking people in Atlanta. The predators silently
even written a warning on the sidewalk. Beware of owl close by. Warning. So today,
what might induce an owl to attack humans? For normal owls, they are trying to defend their territory. But with owls raised by humans, the risk actually increases, because they often identify with humans more, and this could even lead to breeding attempts. Some captive-born owls have been documented landing on people's heads in an attempt to mate. We had one case a few years ago, said a Dutch owl researcher. She also stated that Flaco's behavior was unusual, and that Eurasian eagle owls normally try to stay away from people, not Flaco. At one point, he was referred to as a peeping Tom because of his habit of looking into windows. I'd wager he was looking for somebody to feed him. It's safe to say he was familiar with the concept of buildings, but this didn't stop them from ending his life prematurely. So while people who keep exotic pets have to endure all the hysterics and speculation in the media and breaking news stories about every little scratch that comes from a non-traditionally owned animal, there was zero concern about this enormous non-native bird of prey. This is a city where ferrets are illegal for public safety. The biggest risk I see for Flaco is that he might end up back in the zoo in his tiny cage. So this is what happens when you listen to photographers instead of experts.
Peter Nikoch sadly found him on the ground of a courtyard Friday.
When I came in, I saw him right behind my door, opened arms, and he was still alive.
Yes, Flaco was found alive, suffering for who knows how long, now in distress. I guess at this point, the zoo would be stepping in, as they said. But here's the thing, when birds are in such distress, it is often too late. And this is exactly what happened. Oh, and remember David Barrett?
Something seemed amiss because we were not hearing Flaco. He was not hooting. And he generally hooted every night.
Wait, you felt that there was something wrong with Flaco and you didn't tell anyone? You still felt he should be left alone? And yes, I get that animals in the wild die all the time. This is true. But Flaco is not wild. He was owned by people who are responsible for him. no different from any pet that you own. Upon Flaco's death, animal rights radicals came out of the woodwork to unashamedly confess that they would rather animals be free for a very short time than live in zoos. For example, check out this piece of work from the NY class Instagram. We are devastated to learn that Flaco, the beloved Eurasian owl who escaped cruel captivity in a tiny enclosure in the Central Park Zoo over a year ago to live and fly free, has died after apparently striking a building yesterday. In the meantime, we urge all of those who were enthralled by Flaco's story of thriving in freedom after years of captivity to join our efforts to make New York City the most bird-friendly city in the world. We also urge bird lovers to boycott zoos, caging a wondrous owl like Flaco in a tiny enclosure for 12 years with no ability to live and fly free as nature intended should be unlawful. Rest in peace, Flaco. Yup, you heard that correctly. Animals would rather be dead than live in captivity, and they want zoos to be made illegal. So I hope the AZA is paying attention to this.
He died free as opposed to being trapped in a cage.
This person doesn't mind that Flaco's lifespan dropped from a potential 60 years to 13, with 1 year and 3 weeks spent being free. Yet media outlets gave actors like this a platform, while the zoo seems to constantly look the other way. And the New York Times was a repeat offender. Even after the bird's death, they are still trying to spin some bullshit about Flaco being an inspirational hero instead of a confused animal looking for safety and sustenance. One author starts remarking about prison songs by Snoop Dogg and Nas when describing their less than sane feelings about Flaco being an, quote, outlaw. Another birder, David Lay, is all wrapped up in the fantasy. Flaco was larger than life and is living behind a legacy to match. I thank him today as I did every day I got to see him for the joy, awe, and wonder he inspired in us throughout his journey. This newest one takes the cake from a so-called ecologist who is completely off his rocker. And though we feared for him, his new life thrilled us. How many of us, our circumstances familiar and safe, are too timid to seek our more realized selves? How many of us, viewing our confinements as nothing out of the ordinary, have long stopped wondering what our wings are for? Have we not all yearned for a life beyond the scope of the one we lead? Flaco showed that our yearning is not misplaced, that we were not merely projecting. His choice reaffirmed the truth that given a chance, living things choose agency and freedom of movement. This guy really needs to learn to speak for himself. Not only does he not speak for this bird, his emotional bleeding doesn't represent all humans either. And I find it disturbing that this is a person who has scientific credentials. He's saying things like, in life, Flaco's single year of freedom proved vastly more thrilling and resonant to us than his anonymous years of cage-bound safety, proving that freedom is worth the cost, even when it comes bundled with danger. Does he even think about what he writes? He literally stated that Flaco's life-threatening freedom was justified because humans found it thrilling and resonating. He just completely flat-out admits that human ideals prove this. None of it makes sense, but it's deceptively designed to make certain people feel a certain kind of way. Of course, I'm not an expert on this species, but here's what we know about Eurasian eagle owls. They don't play. They don't look for adventures like some clueless primates do. They are very practical and their needs are simplistic. They are considered sedentary animals that maintain a single territory their entire lives. That is, unless they get chased out by a competitor or food supplies run low. Hence, when Flaco started traveling further away, it's safe to deduce he was chased away by the inspired idiots who were following him around. That could have easily led to him not returning to his enclosure if he even possessed the awareness to do so. Flaco's only instinct was to keep traveling until he found a safe place with adequate food and perhaps a mate in the winter months. Birds just simply do not have these human thoughts. Stop comparing yourself to animals. Flaco doesn't represent you or your desire to quit your 9 to 5. He's not a cartoon character. Hey guys, so here's yet another late edit. I did indeed come across a Twitter post from, you guessed it, David Barrett, back when he and his followers were actually rooting for Flaco to return to the zoo. And it does confirm that Flaco was approaching the zoo at one point and was, quote, looking down at the grounds of the Central Park Zoo. One commenter even says, okay, as an animal rescuer, I would say that there are too many people below. Only the zoo caretaker should be there trying to lure him down. So I think we can safely guess Flaco tried to come back, but being an animal, he's not going to be motivated to return to an area that feels threatening. But here's what's really sad about this situation. It's our complete and utter disregard for our native wildlife in favor of charismatic megafauna, even when they don't belong. Best case scenario, Flaco has only disturbed the animals in Central Park. He has been observed being mobbed by other birds, and he was likely feeding on some of their prey. The obsession with Flaco ironically shows why we need zoos. We need a place to observe exotic animals who do not belong in this part of the world. Flaco, being large and personable in the eyes of humans, was favored over native wildlife just like feral cats are. And like feral cats, he doesn't belong in the wilds of New York any more than the city rats, which happen to be reviled, and they happen to be more intelligent as well. Yet he's fawned over, and pathetically, we have several lawmakers who are trying to create laws because of this situation. We have State Senator Brad Hollyman Siegel announcing that the Bird Safe Buildings Act will now be called the Flaco Act to, quote, honor the positive effect Flaco had on New York City, which is such an incredible BS to have the audacity to say. What's really happening here is that people are trying to spin the story as some wild animal touching the hearts of many and raising awareness about building collisions, while diminishing the role of the criminal who defaced the zoo's property and the fools who encouraged the zoo to permit the outcome. The zoo's silence on this issue was deafening. They effectively told the world that if a captive animal can show that it can find food in the wild, it should be released. Their refusal to capture their own animal, even in the face of danger for the animal, creates a powerful message and a dangerous precedent that lets animal rights nuts dictate the health and safety of their animals. I have seen more than one comment referring to these vandals as heroes. Who's to say that the zoo's refusal to act won't lead to more nuts breaking into zoos? Oh, and by the way, if any vandal is a hero, it's the person who did this.
A mural honoring Central Park's most famous owl, Flaco, was vandalized.
Animals are not in zoos just because they cannot survive in the wild. This fact is unacceptable for some, but we shouldn't pay them any mind. Animals can have all their essential needs provided for in captivity. All of this human idealism and obsession with meaning is not in the animal mind. Animals want to be fed, protected, and perhaps mate. Owls in particular are very simple creatures. They aren't parrots or corvids. How do you think raptors are trained to hunt for humans and return to their owners? They are trained to realize that food awaits them. Food is the most important thing to animals. I find that the calls to change and create new laws to end the use of rat poison and implement modifications to windows to prevent bird collisions in the city, all because of Flaco, are pretty reprehensible and embarrassing for New York City. Many people are acting like they suddenly care about the threat that buildings pose to birds, a problem that has existed for as long as buildings have existed. Yet, when a so-called celebrity owl that fanatics were involved with keeping in an environment that it didn't belong in suffers a window collision, now we have this fake outrage. It needs to be noted that while building collisions frequently cause fatalities in other birds, this isn't really a normal cause of death for wild Eurasian eagle owls. One study that looked into the deaths of 1,576 Eurasian eagle owls showed that collisions of unknown origin accounted for 19.3% of the fatalities in their sample, while the rest were known non-window related causes. So we know that window collisions are likely far less. Yet now he's being made as a poster boy for this cause. Of course, there's nothing wrong with trying to help birds. It's the fact that we only act when something goes viral. What's worse, Flaco was not native to New York State, No, his presence was likely detrimental to native birds, if anything, and yet his name is going to be honored, plastered on laws, and possibly lead to the creation of laws to help protect previously completely ignored wild animals that have been succumbing to these fatalities for centuries. And on top of that, they want to erect a statue of Flaco. You know how they have a statue of Balto, a husky who led a sled team to Nome, Alaska to help combat a disease outbreak? Yeah, so we have this heroic dog, and next to him, we'd literally have a statue that honors vandalism. What kind of message does this send? It really proves that our number one concern is not birds, not real wildlife, but imagined fables in our fragile, desperate, parochial mentalities. A statue of Flaco would be a monument to human, unbridled, mindless idealism and the utter inaction that other worthy causes will continue to face as they wait for their unlikely opportunity to go viral and gain some relevancy among the stampede of New Yorkers. The statue would also celebrate criminals breaking into zoos and would be a disgrace, a stain on New York City's parks. So let's see if they have the audacity to pull such a feat. But sadly, I wouldn't put it past them.